Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Morgan from Allied Installation Supply. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual Valley Week Luncheon. The luncheon is usually a wonderful gathering at Potawatomi Hotel and Casino, but this year it's a wonderful gathering on Zoom. Please enjoy the Valley gift package that you received as part of your registration for today's event. It has some wonderful things from our Valley partners. You can even enjoy a cup of tea during our lunch today. If you didn't receive a gift package, please email the staff or send a note in the chat today and we'll make sure to get one to you. And now we'll have a message from Wisconsin Department of Administration Secretary Joel Brennan.
Hi, it's Joel Brennan from the Department of Administration for the state of Wisconsin. On behalf of Governor Evers and his administration, I want to say thanks to the MVP and to the Menominee Valley for showing for more than 20 years that sustainability and economic development not only go hand in hand, but they can be the centerpiece for rebirth and renewal in Wisconsin. Thanks in particular to the employers, both those who have stayed as anchors over the last 20 plus years and those who are relatively new to the Valley in recent years. You're both part of something great. Thank you also to the visionaries who were there at the start of the reimagination of the Valley more than 20 years ago, many of whom are still actively engaged in the efforts today. You continue to provide inspiration, and you succeeded beyond even your grand vision. The Valley has become a magnet for employers, for families, and for the kind of sustainable economic development that you had in mind decades ago. During my time in state service, I've come to appreciate even more the work that we do in partnership with great projects and great people all around the state, and the Menominee Valley Partners is just a terrific example of that. At the Department of Administration, our coastal management program has partnered with MVP on projects like Stormwater Park, Three Bridges Park, and the Valley's sustainable design criteria. We're proud of that work because it's going to have impact not only in the next few years, but for generations to come. But the state's involvement goes well beyond DOA to the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Transportation, to governor's offices that span administrations and span political parties. The Valley stands as a national example of what can be accomplished when federal, state, and local ingenuity is combined for a higher purpose and a greater calling. Congratulations on the close of your $25 million public-private campaign, and know that the state of Wisconsin will continue to be there to support your vision, your purpose, your work in the years to come as you bring even more economic vitality and sustainability to our region, our state, and our nation. Thanks for all that you do on behalf of Milwaukee, southeastern Wisconsin, and the state of Wisconsin.
Now, please welcome Rodney Ferguson, General Manager of our Valley Week presenting sponsor, Potawatomi Hotel and Casino. Rodney is also a member of the Board of Directors of Menominee Valley Partners. Rodney?
Thanks, Jeff. Welcome to the Menominee Valley Partners Annual Luncheon. As with many things in 2020, this event is very different from those in the past. 1 year ago, we were together celebrating MVP's 20th anniversary in our brand new conference space. 6 months later, our world's turned upside down. Like many businesses, including those who call the Valley home, Potawatomi Hotel and Casino shut its doors for the better part of 3 months. This was done in the best interest of the health and safety of our guests, our team members, and the community. We've all been faced with an unprecedented challenge, and now more than ever, it's important to support the efforts of Menominee Valley Partners. We are proud to once again help MVP shine a light on the Valley by serving as presenting sponsor for Menominee Valley Week. From building a strong business community to promoting the area's natural beauty, MVP has served as a true steward for Menominee Valley that has a proven track record by bringing a once blighted piece of land to prominence. The valley now serves as a model of urban reclamation, and Potawatomi Hotel and Casino is proud to be part of that history. We just can't wait to see what's next. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you, Rodney. We appreciate all of the support you and the Potawatomi give to all of our efforts here in the Valley. And now for the feature portion of our luncheon, we are going to hear from our fabulous Milwaukee historian, John Gurda. Welcome, John.
I'm standing in the roundabout at 25th and Canal. This is the heart of the Menominee Valley, and in some ways the heart of Milwaukee. Canal Street is Milwaukee's baseline. Everything to my right is a south address, everything to my left is north. So the valley plays a central role in Milwaukee, but it didn't always feel that way. For decades, it was a civic embarrassment. The valley was the first thing you saw coming in from the west, and what a sight it was. Freight yards, junk yards, stockyards, a languid, polluted river, not to mention the smell. What you see today is a landscape transformed. The valley has come a long way without moving an inch. But let's start this story at the beginning. And here we are back live, and welcome to Valley Week as it continues. And as this slideshow continues, this first slide here shows the natives who made up Milwaukee's population back in the years before white settlement. And back in those years, the valley gave absolutely no hint of what it would become in later years. One of the entire Milwaukee area's distinguishing features that was really unique here was the abundance of wetland, and the Menominee Valley was by far the largest section of wetland in the entire county. Here you had a marsh that was about a half-mile wide, 4 miles long. It was critically important to the Native Americans who made their homes here for millennia. It was a source of waterfowl, it was a source of fish, it was a canoe route for their main mode of transportation, and certainly it was reeds and rushes for their dwellings and their baskets and other utensils. And perhaps most importantly, it was a source of wild rice. The word Menomin means wild rice in the Algonquian languages, and this was a grocery store for the Native Americans who made their homes here for so very long. Milwaukee, in the years before white settlement, had a mixed population of Potawatomi, still here, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and a variety of other groups. And there were at one time 5 villages on the rim of the Menominee Valley. So this was the concentration of population in the area. You had 2 on Walker's Point. You had 1 near 5th in Wisconsin, another called Lime Ridge around 24th in Wisconsin, and 1 more at Mitchell Park. And this is a drawing of the site of that village. This is the hill just to the east of the Mitchell Park domes. So the kids in the local area, I remember working at Journey House years ago, the kids called this Suicide Hill because it was you had to be rather intrepid to take your sled down here. The village that was located here was on the McQuanago Road, which is now National Avenue. It was an Indian trail that came from Milwaukee out to McQuanago, which was another native settlement of some importance. In 1795, a French Canadian named Jacques Viau put his cabin on the top of the hill. There's still a marker identifying that site, and his kind of post below. So he was there to take advantage of the suppliers who were supplying him with furs, and he brought in, as you can see, he brought in trade goods on these, they called them bateaux, that kind of came in from the lake down Green Bay. So you have white settlers who began to arrive here back in the 1830s. They didn't need either furs or wild rice. And to them, the valley was kind of a curiosity, kind of a watery wilderness at the doorstep of the heart of town. Back in the 1830s, pioneer historian named James Buck offered this description of the valley in its prime. All the marsh proper, he wrote, would in spring be literally alive with fish that came in from the lake. The number of ducks that covered the marsh was beyond all computation. Thousands of young ones could be seen in the breeding season, apparently not a week old, swimming around as happy as need be. And here's a local resident trying to bring one down. So the valley was full of life, but it was anything but stable. There were these mats of wetland vegetation that would break up in high water, releasing what the Milwaukee Sentinel back in 1857 called green floating islands. And you see what I think of probably one of these in the center of the picture. And here's what the Sentinel, how they described, this annual event. Several acres of this fluctuating, unreal estate took another trip up the river on Saturday, lodging itself in large quantities at each of the bridges from the Menominee up. It gave our river the appearance of a small bay dotted with luxuriant islands. So it was something that would kind of break up and float downstream. The valley was also a place for urban adventures, and hard to believe today, but it was fairly easy to get lost. In 1861, the Sentinel described the adventures of a pair of sportsmen. So when you fancy yourself sailing up the stream, chances are you are only being lured into a cul-de-sac of wild rice. And when you fondly imagine you are miles away from the city, some sudden turn will bring you up before a great brewery or shipyard where several hundred employees stare at you ironically. And there was one pair that they're describing in one of these journeys who actually spent all night there. They were shooting ducks, or trying to at least, and as the Sentinel reported, a deputation of friends found them in the morning wildly shooting about amid the wild rice opposite Melm's Garden. That's around 7th and National, that area. Both completely worn out, having rode some 18 or 20 miles without getting out of the bayou. Imagine that in 2020. Remarkable shift in the landscape. But that all changed as Milwaukee grew. The city, as it grew, depended absolutely on both rail and water transportation to move people in and farm products out. And the Menominee Valley had the greatest potential to support both. So the first railroad in Wisconsin chugged west from not too far from today's Amtrak depot, the intermodal depot down there. And it traveled to Waukesha in 1851 at the breakneck speed of what was then 30 miles an hour, which was really trying to jet travel, back in 1851. And building that line was a real challenge. The construction crews working in the valley portion of that line would come back to work every morning finding that the tracks had been swallowed by the marsh and the night before. So the valley's appetite for railroad iron was eventually satisfied. And in fact, it became the rail center of southeastern Wisconsin. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad put its main facility for building and repairing all its rolling stock in the valley west of what's now 35th Street. Here's the roundhouse from the inside. And here, as you can see, kind of middle distance, here's a roundhouse from the outside. They built the Milwaukee road shops back here in 1880, and they were for a number of years the largest employer in Milwaukee. But you will also notice that as they filled in this ground for freight yards and factory buildings, there was still wetland here. So this persisted for a very, very long time. And after a while, the focus shifted not just from transportation, but to manufacturing. Milwaukee became not just a shipping center, not just a point of exchange between the interior and Lake Michigan, but a producer of finished goods in its own right. As industrialization gathered steam in Milwaukee, land in the heart of town became increasingly scarce, so developers looked to the Menominee Valley. Here you had square miles of land, or at least potential land, at the very heart of town. It was wet, but that's something you could fix in time. So the valley's margins filled in first, and on the south rim, you had some industries that are still household words in the Milwaukee area. This, as you can see, is the Pfister and Vogel Tannery, and this is the 6th Street Bridge here in the lower right-hand corner. And you can see development in the valley proper. The tannery actually began earlier on the south rim around 6th Street, way back in 1848. which is just 2 years after Milwaukee receives its charter. And that plant grew to become the flagship facility of the largest tanning company in America and located in the largest tanning center on earth. So tanning was a huge part of the Milwaukee economy. In time, that complex filled 38 buildings on 15 acres of land. And as you know, some of these buildings are still here, and it is now offices and a gated residential community, which the tannery workers would find a pretty remarkable transformation. So here's a lithograph, and here's a photograph of the Pfister and Vogel tannery. And what you see here is a mountain of tan bark. The way they tanned hides back in those years was they would take hemlock bark especially, of which Wisconsin had an abundance, and chip it and stew it like a tea, and that was the source of tannin, which is why you see these root beer colored rivers and lakes up north. It's all kind of leached out of the vegetation in the area, and the tannin became the means of tanning hides. So this was a really important part of the Milwaukee economy. So you have other employers on the south rim of the valley, and one of those was the Melms Brewery, talking about the deputation of friends trying to find the hunters. And I think that's these buildings right around here, just a couple blocks west of 6th Street. In 1870, that became a Pabst facility. Farther west, around 16th Street, you have the Burnham Brothers Brickyard, and that became not the only, but the major source of the building material, the bricks that became Milwaukee's most famous building material as the Cream City. And way out in the country, around 30th Street, you have the Bavarian immigrant named Franz Falk, who back in 1856 opens a brewery. And by the 1870s, he is number 4 in Milwaukee, behind only Pabst and Schlitz and Blatz. And incredibly, one of these buildings is still there on the South Rim, going way back to 1870. So there was a comparable gathering of capital and labor on the north rim of the Menominee Valley. The Manigault family had a flour mill at the junction of the Menominee and Milwaukee rivers. You had the first meatpacking plants, Frederick Layton and John Plankinton. Farther west, around what is now the 27th Street Viaduct, you have what was called the Meadow Springs Distillery. And what they did was they turned the hard grains from Milwaukee farms or Wisconsin farms into hard liquor. And I think some of you recall the smell was indelibly imprinted on our olfactory systems. This is where Red Star yeast began. They shifted from distilling liquor to making yeast, and that was by far the most identifiable smell in the Menominee Valley. So when those margins were finally full, the developers turned their attention to the valley proper, and the result was one of the largest infrastructure projects in the entire 19th century. This was called the Menominee Improvements, and it began back in 1869. And what it meant was that tons of gravel were borrowed from both bluffs on the north and south rims of the valley. They didn't return it, they borrowed it. That just meant they kind of moved it to the valley and left it there. And miles of canals and slips and docks and railroad tracks were put in the heart of the valley. And this all happened really pretty fast. The Menominee improvements began back in 1869. And just 2 years later, the Milwaukee Sentinel in 1871 filed this description of the valley. The paper wrote, "Few residents of Milwaukee, comparatively speaking, are aware of the great transformation that is taking place in the Menominee Valley. The marsh, which has hitherto been devoted to the growth of pond lilies, rushes, and rank grass, is yielding to engineering skill and industry and is becoming most desirable and valuable property. It became, in fact, the most valuable industrial real estate in the entire state of Wisconsin. Here you had rail transportation, water transportation near the heart of town and close to densely built neighborhoods that provided labor. So landfill was continuous through the 1800s. And this is a lithograph from 1886. And you'll notice this is, at this point, some years after the project began, there is still shallow water in the heart of the valley. Here's the Pfister and Vogel Tannery. And the odd feature here is Krager's skating rink. in the shadow of basically what's now the 6th Street Viaduct. There's a guy named Ice Bear Kroger who sold ice and also had a skating rink. So they filled this in, but it took a long time, and they weren't real picky about what they used as fill. The gravel was the most important, kind of the aggregate that they used from both sides. That was probably the bulk of it. But they would use anything they could get their hands on. In 1886, the same year as this lithograph shows, the Sentinel reported on what was happening behind a free dump sign. Here, rotten potatoes and fruit, the contents of paunches and entrails of animals, the refuse of meat shops, and all sorts of filth are deposited in the marsh, and the thin covering of ashes and dirt placed over them. So this was not what you call clean fill by any means. By 1910, most parcels were developed, and what you had was a world-class concentration of employment. The pioneers remained. Pfister and Vogel kept on growing, and you had the meatpacking plants, Layton and Plankinton, moving out from the edges to the heart of the Menominee Valley. Plankinton later on became Cudahy, which moved in 1895 down to the south suburbs. So you have packing plants and tanneries, but the main emphasis back in those years as that transformation continued was on manufacturing. On the North Rim, you had the Kiefer Stamping Company along St. Paul. This was later known as National Enameling and Stamping Company. And figure out the acronym, National Enameling and Stamping, NESCO. This is NESCO. So NESCO was headquartered on the North Rim of the Menominee Valley. And among other things, they produced roasters that made generations of church dinners possible. You also had Cutler Hammer on the North Rim, made industrial controls. Palmolive Soap was on the North Rim until they moved to Chicago back in 1923. Goiter, Paschke, and Fry was there along St. Paul, made lunch pails, spittoons, mailboxes under the Cream City brand. That is now Third Space, uses one of their buildings, the brewery. And you also have in the heart of the valley an employer who is still there. This is the Falk Gear Shop, now part of Rexnord. But it began with the parent, Franz Falk's brewery on the South Rim, and his son Herman began to tinker in the shop in the old brewery premises, and then moved on to land the family owned in the Menominee Valley, filled that in, and in time became America's largest producer of these huge industrial herringbone gears. And these went all over the world. And Falk was not just gears. They had a foundry that was among the largest in Milwaukee. And some of their products included this snail shell turbine used in a hydroelectric dam. Look at the size of this thing. The products down in the valley were really pretty remarkable in terms of their scale. So that's the heart of the valley. On the South Rim, you had the Chain Belt Company, and this is just west of 16th along Bruce. And here you can see Rex, Sprocket, and Chain. They made endless lengths of metal chain that replaced leather belts in industry, as well as kind of drives for Caterpillar type crawlers. And just west of them, you can just make this out, it says Milwaukee Works. That was the International Harvester Plant. And it's where Miller Compressing is now on the south rim of the valley. And they made farm machinery, including tractors. And they would test those tractors, they kind of hill climb on what's now the bluffs of Mitchell Park. And there are stories from those early years about unearthing lots of native artifacts, including arrowheads, because the village was right there. Jacques Viau put his home, and that was for centuries a Native American village as well. So you have Chain Belt there on around 16th. Pauling and Harnischfeger moves from Walker's Point out to what's now Miller Parkway on National Avenue, now Komatsu. So a long history of employment on that site. Look at the age of some of these guys. These are young men, kind of back in the days when sixth grade was about as far as many would hope to get. And they became the nation's largest manufacturer of overhead cranes, later moved into construction and mining equipment. So what you had in the valley was this world-class concentration of employment, tens of thousands of jobs. And never seen a reliable number, but there were certainly tens of thousands. And you had what was sometimes called the bucket brigade of workers who would march in the morning with their lunch pails and march out again in the evening. And the newsboy down here was ready to intercept them. So the valley almost breathed, it kind of breathed in its workers, shift change and exhale, others coming to neighborhoods on both sides, Merrill Park, Pigsville on the north side, Silver City, Walker's Point, and Clark Square on the south side. And those neighborhoods were literally created in many ways, by the valley because it offered a source of employment. So this was not an aesthetic triumph as important as it was economically. The valley was not a place where the tourists would flock in thousands. So here's an aerial view from the mid-decades, probably maybe 20s, 30s, in the 20th century. And there was, even before then, just a huge problem with what you might call scent pollution. In 1874, the Milwaukee Sentinel described the smell in a distillery on the South Canal here on the left side of the aerial photograph. The paper said that the distillery was charged with producing a nuisance simply stupendous in character. Certain it is that from some cause that body of water is a river of death, disgusting in the extreme to the olfactories and fearfully offensive to the eyes. From its frightfully filthy depths arise boiling springs and a stench so penetrating and all-pervading as to be utterly unbearable. What do you really think? So that was relatively typical of what was going on in some places of the valley. They put an intercepting sewer in back in 1886, and that helped to solve the immediate problems, but it simply carried all that filth out to Lake Michigan, our inner harbor, where we got our drinking water. So it's simply kind of moving a problem. Milwaukee's solid waste problems also reached critical proportions during those years, and the valley was the site of one effort to solve them. In 1890, the city itself put what they called a garbage crematory, an incinerator basically, in the valley east of 16th Street. And summer winds from the south would blow odors from that crematory right over the mansions of Grand Avenue. So that row from 9th Street all the way to 40th. And those residents howled. The health commissioner, a guy named Uriel Wingate, he wasn't moved. He said, the whole valley has been a dumping ground for years. Its condition is growing worse, and it will continue to get worse until it is filled. He also said he had no power to shut down any business unless it was causing sickness. Smells were not enough. Smells alone were not enough to take action. And he said, we cannot very well afford to lose the $3 to $4 million invested there. 3 to 4 million, a little larger buying power back in those years. So they finally yielded to complaints and they closed that crematory, and instead they loaded the garbage on a scow and towed it out into Lake Michigan and dumped it. So again, moving a problem. Air pollution was probably terrible even without that incinerator. When everyone burned coal for everything, whether it was home heating or industrial power, the pall of smoke that settled over Milwaukee was absolutely stifling. If the wind blew from the south over the valley on wash day, which was Monday, the women of Merrill Park didn't even try to hang out their clothes. They knew it would just be covered with soot by the time they'd had time to dry it and bring it in. A lot of that coal was stored on the North Channel of the Menominee Valley, and a lot of it was burned in this gas house, which you all recognize there around 24th Street. And the gas works made a contribution to water pollution as well as air pollution. Back in the 1920s, the Milwaukeeans began to complain of an obnoxious taste in their tap water, so strong it overwhelmed the taste of their coffee, their tea, and their home brewed beer. So here's the gasworks facing east. You can see City Hall over here on the horizon. And here's the same complex facing west. So they have what they call gas holders. This is manufactured gas, is what they called it. They would burn coal in the absence of oxygen, and that would kind of produce a gas they'd use for heating, cooking, and power. And I recall this as a kid. There was a complex of these gas holders here, and they would rise and fall depending on the use of the volume. So it's kind of like a piston, that held that gas. And as they burned that gas, they would dump a waste product, a phenol-laden coal tar, into the Menominee River. So it was a direct pipe, from the gas plant into the river. And that was finally uncovered by city inspectors. And what it was doing was drifting downstream into the city's water intake. So you had coal tar, coming through the water pipes into Milwaukee's homes. The health commissioner at the time, a guy named George Rulin by this time, he said better treatment would solve the taste problem eventually, but in the meantime, Milwaukeeans would just have to close their eyes and swallow. So what he said, the only way to prevent the dumping of industrial waste from these plants into the lake is to shut them down, which so far as the gas plant is concerned is impossible, as it would leave the greater part of Milwaukee's population without means of preparing food. So you have economic necessity and kind of trumping, essentially public health is what it amounted to. So the Menominee Valley may not have been a pretty sight, but it was absolutely essential. It was critically important to the local economy, and it maintained that valley vitality into modern times. And we're going to kind of move ahead quickly in a couple of slides. The Depression, beginning in the 1929, peaking or actually plummeting in the early 30s, was a long time out for the Menominee Valley and the economy as a whole. And when things came back to life, it was during the buildup for World War II, and all these valley plants were just going nuts in terms of production. The Falk plant, shown here, actually doubled its capacity, and they were so busy. I did the history of the Falk Company back in 1892, or back in 1992, going back to for their centennial. And I met a guy, a retiree, to recall working in the shops here, turning out war materiel, including clutches for LSTs, all kinds of other war munitions and materiel. He worked 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for 4.5 years. So the valley was busier than it has ever been, and that was typical of all the shops in Milwaukee. The decline began after World War II. Here's an aerial from the 1950s, and you can see there is vacant land here. There's been some disinvestment in the Menominee Valley. Semi-trailers replaced railroads as among the prime movers of goods. Superhighways freed industries to locate virtually anywhere, which is exactly what they did. And you have kind of a de-industrialization beginning back in the 1950s, but you also had some major changes here. This is a landscape portion, very hard to locate today, but just look at the landmarks here. This is the Wisconsin Avenue Viaduct between 35th and 43rd or so. Here's Miller Brewing right behind here. And here's what's now Interstate 94. It was then the Rapid Transit streetcar line. This was an athletic facility, and what it became was the home of County Stadium in 1953. So all these athletic fields that were sandlot baseball became professional baseball back in 53. And just to orient you here, here's the VA Center. And here is the Harnischfeger, now the Komatsu plant here in the upper right. And here's the rapid transit line that became Interstate 94. So for the first time since those hunters were paddling around and getting lost way back in the 1850s, people came to the valley for something other than work. So the beginning in some ways of kind of the modern period in the valley's history. But those freeways along the rapid transit really had a profound impact on Milwaukee and the valley as a whole. Here's the Market Interchange, and this runs west along that rapid transit line, which was erased. Now there's a high tension line there. You can still see the towers there, but it replaced and displaced all that streetcar transportation. And it was during this period that I came to know the Valley pretty intimately. In the summer of '67, I worked on a construction job working on the high-rise bridge. And I was known that my job was, they called it being a stripper. I worked as a stripper for the summer of '67. And what that meant was when the high-rise bridge here in the middle of the frame, when that was, the concrete had cured, our job was to strip the plywood forms off the bottom for these things that kind of hung very precariously attached to the I-beams. And for years thereafter, the smell of that tallow plant was sort of soaked into my skin and became quite nostalgic for me over the years. So certainly by that time, the Valley had seen better days. The river itself was so filthy that the carp actually came up for air. There was not enough oxygen in the water. Canal Street was a panorama of grease-soaked junkyards, weed-choked vacant lots, and night spots that any reasonable person would instinctively avoid. There were faint stirrings in the late 1960s, late 70s rather, when the city purchased several vacant parcels in the valley for an industrial land bank. And think of the irony of having an industrial land bank in what had once been the heart of industry in Milwaukee. The pace began to accelerate under Mayor John Norquist in the 80s and 90s. Industrial development was still key, but the city also began to think about amenities that would appeal to a broader clientele, and we're kind of coming up to the present here, including bicycle trails, parkland, and even a golf course was proposed, one that you would have guessed would have long, narrow freeways along the valley proper. So while the planners were planning away, new players entered the scene. In 1991, the Potawatomi tribe built its first bingo hall on land that had once been a critically important resource for their ancestors. 2 years later, and literally across the street, Marquette University developed its Valley Fields Athletic Complex on what had been a former coal yard right across the street. In 2001, Miller Park rose from the Valley's western horizon as the new home of the Milwaukee Brewers and replacing County Stadium. In 2008, Harley-Davidson built a state-of-the-art museum on 6th Street and Canal. And the river came back to life at the same time. There were fewer polluters, there were tighter controls, and the deep tunnel project that went operational back in 1993 allowed the stream to breathe freely again for the first time in generations. Salmon came where carp had struggled to breathe. So it was just a remarkable transformation. And it was no longer unthinkable to put a canoe or a kayak in the water in the Menominee River. So the valley was coming back. And in 1999, 21 years ago, 21 years ago, a new organization was formed to give the movement direction and focus. That was Menominee Valley Partners. We are celebrating today, representing just about every stakeholder in the entire district. And MVP and its partners came up with a master plan whose dominant themes were clean industry and nature. Those two, sometimes thought of as oppositional, developed in tandem. So today you have 21st century industries employing hundreds of workers, and they share the valley with bike trails, stormwater retention ponds, and Three Bridges Park, which is Milwaukee's newest and certainly among its most unusual. And amazingly, in 2012, the Urban Ecology Center opened its third branch in a converted tavern overlooking the Menominee River. The Menominee Valley has become an outdoor classroom, something that would have made a previous generation of Milwaukeeans burst into laughter. So the unthinkable has become a reality in the valley today. There's also been restoration. Most of the valley's original buildings are long gone, but one survivor is that old polluting gas works that was once among the grittiest, grimiest places in town. It now houses one of our leading architectural firms, Zimmerman Architects, as well as a bike and skateboard park and a craft brewery, City Lights. I think the term for that is paradigm shift. There's certainly been in evidence in the Menominee Valley. And so to close, we circle back to the beginning. The valley was once a wild rice marsh supporting a large native population. It became an industrial landscape supporting a large working class. Then it became derelict industrial land, a highly visible eyesore supporting not much at all. Today, it is undergoing another transformation. The public and private sectors have joined forces to fashion a new future for this historic landscape, one that's good for the economy, good for the environment, and good for the community as a whole. After 175 years of use and abuse, change and channeling, the Menominee Valley has rounded a new bend in its long and winding journey.
Thank you, John. It is amazing to hear and see that early history of the Valley and also your telling of the transformation that continues today. Now I'd like to introduce Corey Zetz, Executive Director of Menominee Valley Partners, who will share an update on things happening in the Valley. Corey?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day away from work, from overseeing school for a number of you, all that's on your plates to just pause and celebrate with us today. We're grateful to have you here. I also want to thank all of our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, Potawatomi Hotel and Casino, and all the other sponsors who have made Valley Week possible. Thank you for supporting us and at this time. And then to just give a round of applause to John Gurda. Thank you for sharing the history of the Valley with us today. It's always so great to hear from you and really inspiring. I think the story of the Valley is something that we still take lessons from today. There have been some dark days in the Valley, but recent days are really a story of hope. And I think as we've seen in the Valley, that we can do really hard things, things that we never thought we would be capable of. From the river of death, as John said, the Menominee was known as, to our water quality, the recreation today, the resurgence of businesses. In the last 20 years, we've had over 300 acres redeveloped. More than 50 companies have moved here to the Valley. We've got thousands of new jobs and 60 acres of new recreational spaces in Three Bridges Park, the Hank State Trail, and a really active, vibrant Menominee River. It's amazing. So I think that just remembering that we can do hard things is always a good reminder, but especially in these days, which feel challenging in a whole new way. The reclamation story of the Valley is what it is because people got involved and they cared enough to devote time and energy to changing things that they saw here. They saw problems and decided to be part of the solution. So as time evolves, the story of the Valley continues to evolve. New issues and problems continue to arise. Like today, building a workforce for tomorrow that is inclusive and representative of our community's population. And new people continue to rise to be part of those solutions.
Hi, I'm Robin from Rexnord, and I got involved in the career pathways discussions because a young woman was touring our plant, and she was walking through, and at the end of the tour, our CEO came to her and said, well, how'd the tour go? What did you think? And she said, it was a great tour, you have a beautiful plant, but I want to be an engineer, and I don't think I can be an engineer because I don't see anybody who looks like me in your plant. And with that, the plant came to me and said, we've got to do something about this. And I started working with Katrina and Menominee Valley Partners, and we created a Kids in Manufacturing and Kids in STEM tours for the plant and discussions about engineering, but then also a Girls in STEM and a Girls in Manufacturing day-long experience that includes mentoring, it includes plant tours. And this is just such a great way for Rexnord to be involved in developing the youth in the community around us and trying to find the best talent who wants to be with us and will look for us in the future. I really encourage other businesses to do the same because I think this is a great outreach to touch the lives of the community around us.
Thanks to Robin and all of the Valley employees who've been engaged in the career programming with MVP. Because of them, hundreds of kids every year are exposed to career paths. They talk with mentors. They find their way here to be our next generation workforce. Thanks to all of you who have had ideas about how to reach out to the next generation and who have put those into action, and everyone who supports those programs. In this year, as so much has closed around us, even temporarily, we saw people embrace the outdoors in the Valley as never before. The number of visits to Three Bridges Park and the Hank Aaron State Trail ballooned this year. The Menominee River was full of kayaks and canoes on any given day. We see that our parks, rivers, and trails are so important to community health. But the care and the stewardship of these places in the Valley is really a community effort led by volunteers, especially all the Menominee River Valley businesses who steward our parks and trails through our stew crews. I think we have a stew crew video popping up. There we go.
I am Sarah Young and I am with Charter Wire. I've been here for about a year and a half, so this is my second summer doing stew crew. We generally have a crew that goes out every month, and it ranges from about 5 to probably about 10 people. We're responsible for picking up the northeast end of the immediate valley here right near our work, and we really like doing it. We generally have about the same people who do this every single month, and everybody really likes just getting out and taking pride in our work community. We're here for more waking hours than we are in our home communities, so for us it's just really important that when we're driving to and from work and walking around at lunchtime, that we have something that we can take pride in. Generally, there's not a ton of stuff going on anyhow, in terms of like so much garbage that it's overwhelming or anything like that, but every little bit helps. So we love doing that. Everybody loves getting out during lunches to do this, so we're really proud to be part of the Valley and proud to be doing stew crew.
So shout out to all of the stew crew members throughout the Valley, all of the volunteers for Menominee Valley Partners, the Hank Aaron State Trail, and the Urban Ecology Center, who are keeping the spaces in the Valley beautiful and inviting for everyone to enjoy. So thank you all. This really is a community effort. All the successes in the Valley in the recent years are really because of so many of the people with us here today. So thank you all. We're grateful that so many people keep rising to the challenges and making the Valley a better place every day. Thanks to everyone for helping to keep that story of the Valley moving forward, and we're excited to see what the next chapter brings. So we'd like to lift a mug of tea. I think you all have your Rishi tea made in the Valley. If you want to turn on your cameras for a quick cheers, so we can get a photo. Usually we have wonderful photos of everyone together at our Valley Week events, but since we're virtual, we just want to raise a mug and cheers to all of you. Thank you. Okay, back to you, Jeff.
And now, to wrap things up, a message from the president of Menominee Valley Partners, Bruce Keys.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, everybody, for attending. As Jeff indicated, my name is Bruce Keys. I'm the president of the board for Menominee Valley Partners. As you heard from John and as we've witnessed, the Valley is a resilient place. It's a model of resilience. If there's a lesson that we can learn from the Valley, I think one of the lessons is that there will be times that are prosperous, and there are going to be times where we face strife. And certainly this is one of those times where we are suffering a certain amount of strife. At times in the history of the Valley, we've been a community divided. And certainly now is a time where we're very aware that Black Lives Matter and that there is a division in our community. The other lesson that I think we learn, though, is that there are times that we bring community together. And when we bring community together, we can surpass strife and we can rediscover those times to prosper. I want to look forward to those times. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to especially thank John Gurda. John, I always enjoy your presentations, and there's a good library of them. My grateful appreciation to Rodney Ferguson and to Potawatomi for being the title sponsor. A great thanks to the Corey Zetz and Menominee Valley Partners staff, who are just always outstanding, and we've come to know them well. Cheers to my fellow board members and to the Business Improvement District, and finally to all of you who make this journey of ours one well worth traveling. So be safe, get outdoors, and enjoy the rest of Valley Week. Thank you for coming.